Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for this reInvent session on the AWS Cloud Development Kit. My name is Jason Fulgham and I'm a Senior Manager in AWS Developer Tools. I've had the pleasure of managing the CDK team for the past 3 years, and I'm excited to be here today talking to you about what we've been working on since our GA launch last year. All right, we've got a pretty straightforward agenda for today's session. I'm going to start off with a little bit of context on what the CDK is, just to cover some basics. And we're really going to spend the bulk of our time in the What's New section of this session. So I'm going to talk about some of the new features we've launched, some of the new products that have come out, and we're going to take a look at a demo of one of our largest features, CDK Pipelines. After that, we're going to talk about a couple of new projects that the team is just starting to work on that you can look forward to launching in 2021. And then finally, I'm going to wrap things up with some resources where you can go to learn more about everything we talk about. We're going to be covering a lot of different features and products and announcements today, so I'm going to leave you with a bunch of resources where you can go and dig in deeper and learn more about them. All right, we've got a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. So we defined the AWS Cloud Development Kit as a multi-language software development framework for modeling cloud infrastructure as reusable components. There's a lot packed into that sentence, so let's break that down a little bit and talk about what that really means. So the first part of that description is a multi-language software development framework. The CDK is available in TypeScript, JavaScript, Java, .NET, and Python, and we keep all of these code bases in sync, so no matter what language you want to use, you've got a consistent interface to interact with AWS infrastructure. We provide the CDK in all these languages so that you can use the same language for your infrastructure code as you use for your application code. And because of this, you immediately get this really rich authoring experience when you're working with your CDK code. So you get all the power of the development tools that you already know how to use. You get content assist help in your IDE. You get all the tooling of your IDE to help you explore and learn the APIs. You get inline documentation, and for type check languages, you get all the safety of a type checking system too. So the next part of the description is for modeling cloud infrastructure. And the term modeling is really important here. So remember that we're not writing the actual code that's going to go and create our infrastructure. What we're really doing is writing code that models this desired state that we want for our infrastructure. So we're always working in this desired state paradigm where we model the desired state we want, and then we pass that over to a provisioning engine such as AWS CloudFormation, and that provisioning engine is what's going to look at that model and actually realize that configuration for us. And then last but certainly not least is as reusable components. This is the thing that really gets me excited about the CDK, and I think this is easily the superpower of the CDK. So we talk a lot about the rich authoring experience, but I think really what makes the CDK so powerful is its ability to encapsulate and create these reusable patterns. And we're going to be talking about that more later in this session too. If you are brand new to the CDK, I want to quickly mention the CDK Workshop. It's a really great online workshop. It's fun to work through it. It's available in different programming languages. And it's a great way to get your hands on some CDK code and learn the most important concepts for working with CDK applications. All right, so now that we set some context, let's get into the meat of this session and talk about what's been going on in the CDK over the past year. So I want to start off by quickly mentioning the CDK Public Roadmap. So earlier this year, we launched a public roadmap, and really the goal of that is to provide some higher level visibility about the different projects and areas that we're working on in the CDK. And of course, the big benefit for us is that this is another opportunity, another mechanism where we can communicate with our customers. So we love seeing +1s on these issues or questions about requirements for these issues. This is incredibly helpful for us to prioritize and make sure we're delivering the right features that you need. So we'd love to hear from you all on the CDK Public Roadmap. The first area of the CDK codebase that I want to talk about is the AWS Construct Library. So you can think of the AWS Construct Library really as the standard library for working with AWS infrastructure. And we hear from so many customers that it's really this Construct Library experience that's made them fall in love with using the CDK. So we've been investing a lot of energy and effort in expanding the Construct Library, graduating more modules to be generally available and have that production ready backwards compatible guarantee for the APIs. And this year we've graduated 8 additional modules in the Construct Library to be GA. And we have a little over half a dozen other modules that we're actively working on and pushing towards graduation. I also want to give a huge shout out to the community of open source contributors for the AWS CDK. We've really been blown away over and over by all the support and all the contributions we've gotten from the open source community. And it's been so fun for the team and I to work with all these different contributors. So if you are already a contributor to the AWS CDK, I want to thank you for the time and effort you've spent to send us those contributions. If you're not a contributor but you're interested in contributing, there's a great reInvent session from last year where one of our senior engineers dives into the process for contributing and how to make contributions to the AWS Construct Library. All right, so let's go a little bit deeper into the Construct Library. I want to spend some time talking about one of the largest new modules that we've developed this year. So the new CDK Pipelines module allows you to easily create a continuous delivery pipeline for any CDK application, no matter how simple or how complex that application is. So it lets you encode the configuration for your CD pipeline directly alongside your infrastructure code, directly alongside your application code. So the really cool thing is that as you evolve your configuration for your pipeline, you've got this same workflow that you do for your application code. So you get this really nice GitOps flow where we make changes locally, we update the pipeline configuration. When we push those changes up to the origin server, our pipeline is going to pick them up, modify the pipeline as necessary, and run all those changes through the pipeline. So we'll take a demo in a second. We'll take a look at how that actually works and what that workflow is. Far and away, though, my favorite feature of CDK Pipelines is how easy it makes it to manage cross-account and cross-region configurations. So before CDK Pipelines, if you wanted to set this up by hand, it's a fairly complex operation for you to configure all these settings, and you really need to very deeply understand a lot of these security settings to set this up correctly and securely. The thing that I love about CDK Pipelines is that you really just declare which parts of your application, which stacks of infrastructure, which region and which account you want them to run in, and then CDK Pipelines will handle configuring all that at a lower level for you, and it'll make sure your pipeline and your configuration is set up correctly and securely. So this feature is still in developer preview. We launched it earlier this year. We've been getting a lot of good feedback on it, but we really need more help getting more feedback before we lock down the APIs and mark this as production ready. I'm going to jump into a demo in just a second, but I also want to point out that there's a lot more in this feature that we don't really have time to show you today. So I hope that you will check out the deep dive we did in an AWS Online Tech Talk on enhanced CI/CD with the AWS CDK. We did that webinar a couple months ago, and it goes into a lot more details on the CDK Pipelines feature. It shows you how you can set up testing actions, for example, in different stages before you promote to production. So the webinar is a great place to go learn more about this feature if you're curious. So before we jump into the code, I want to show you a representation of the application that we're working with. So before CDK Pipelines, this is how your CDK application probably looked. You had the top level container as your CDK app, and then within your CDK app, you directly contain as many infrastructure stacks as you want. A simple application might have a single stack. A more complex application could have hundreds of stacks in it. But this is pretty much the structure for a CDK application. This does change a little bit when we switch over to using CDK Pipelines. So instead of these stacks being directly inside your application, the CDK pipeline is going to be directly inside the CDK app, and then those application infrastructure stacks are going to be configured inside stages of your pipeline. So we'll go see this in code in just a second, and the demo that we're going to show is how we can modify our pipeline configuration to add this pre-production stage with this manual approval gate before anything gets promoted to production. All right, so let's take a closer look at this application here that we're working on for this demo code. And I want to point out that this is the same sample code that we're using in the webinar I mentioned. So if you do go check out that webinar, you can download this code for TypeScript, or you can download it for Python. And of course, you can use the CDK to write the same experience in Java or .NET too. So we're at the starting point for our CDK application here. And the very first thing you should notice is where we're declaring this application here on line 6. So this is our CDK application. It's the start of our app, just like we saw in the slides a second ago. And then within that app, the next thing that we're creating is our pipeline stack. So this is going to have all the infrastructure for our CDK pipeline. We pass in the app as the first parameter, which essentially creates this stack in the context of that app. So let's go look inside this stack and see what's in there. The first thing we see is that this is just like any other stack with the CDK. It's a stack of infrastructure. And then within this the stack, we're declaring the different actions that we need for our pipeline. So the first thing that we need to declare is where our pipeline is going to get our source code from. So for that, we instantiate this GitHub source action that comes from the code pipeline module in the CDK. And then we're configuring the GitHub repository where we have our sample app stored. So this is what's going to configure our pipeline to poll our repository and trigger the pipeline to run when new changes come in. This next block of code here is our simple synth action. So this is going to be the build stage in our pipeline. It's going to build our application, and it's going to run the CDK synth command that's going to create our cloud assembly that enables us to pass on our templates and our assets to actually deploy and provision. So once we've got this source action and this synth action created, the next thing we do is actually create the CDK pipeline object itself. And then from there, we're just working with this pipeline to customize it and add any stages we need for whatever our application needs. In this really simple example, we just have one single application stage that serves as our production stage. So this matches up exactly with what we just saw in the slides. Let's take a look over in the AWS Code Pipeline console and take a look at how this looks in the AWS console. So just like we'd expect, the pipeline created from this code has a source stage, a build stage, and then it has these other two stages that are implicitly added by the CDK. So this first stage is what's going to actually make our pipeline self-modifying when we run pipeline changes through it. And the second stage is added for any assets that we have in our application to manage them. And then at the end of the pipeline, we've got our production stage that actually runs our web service. So now that you understand the simple application that we've got here, let's take a look at how we can actually change the configuration for our pipeline and add this pre-production stage like we saw in the slides a second ago. So the great thing about CDK pipelines is that it's up to you on how you want to structure and customize your pipeline. Different setups are going to make sense for different apps and for different teams. For us here in this simple example, we're simply going to essentially copy that production stage and set up a duplicate stage as a pre-production stage where we can do some more manual testing. And then we're going to add this manual approval action so we can go and just release that manual gate when we are ready to deploy to production. So your app, you might want to set up differently. Maybe you want to use smaller EC2 sizes for pre-production or earlier stages, or maybe you want to have a smaller cluster size. And that's all very easy to do since this is all just code and you can pass in whatever parameters you want to customize. So we're adding this pre-prod stage here to our pipeline. So we've just added this new stage right before our prod stage. And then as we look at this pre-prod stage, we can pop open the Content Assist in the IDE and we can browse the APIs a little bit. And we see a little bit of that rich authoring experience I talked about before, where we can use our IDE to review the documentation and just kind of understand the different APIs available to us. For example, here is where we could add different actions if we wanted to add testing actions to automatically run tests as part of our pipeline before we promote. Or if we wanted to run completely other additional applications in different stages, we could do that with this add application operation. But for our demo, we're just going to add this simple manual approval action. So now we're going to check out this workflow for how we've updated our pipeline configuration, and now we're going to look at how we actually get that out to production. So just like any other Git flow, we're checking this change into our local Git repository, and then we're going to push that up to our origin server. And that's what's going to trigger our pipeline to run and update these changes. So this is going to take probably 5 minutes or so for the pipeline to pick up this change, notice, build our application, notice that it's a change to the pipeline configuration, and run the change through it again after changing the pipeline. So in just a second, our video is going to fast forward about 5 minutes or so, and we should see this new pre-prod stage. So here we are. We can see that 5 minutes or so later, we now have this new pre-prod stage available in our code pipeline. So this is exactly what we added in code. You can see at the bottom we've got this manual approval action, and it was pretty easy for us to make that change in code and then just use that nice Git workflow where we can push the change up and have the code pipeline pick it up and even modify the pipeline itself. So that was really just scratching the surface on what you can do with pipelines and kind of showing the basic developer experience for how you use CDK pipelines. We're very excited about this feature, and we think it's going to be really useful to pretty much anybody building CDK applications. So I hope that you will dig in a little bit, try out this feature, and share your feedback with us. All right, so we've talked a lot about the AWS Construct Library so far, but that's really only part of the story. I want to talk about another theme that we've been seeing happen over the past year that we're also really excited about. So on the CDK team, we provide the AWS Construct Library. We own this, and we're responsible for delivering it to our customers. And we talked about before that you can think of this Construct Library as really the standard library for working with AWS. But we always had this vision that we wanted customers and other teams and other companies to build on top of that construct library and provide even higher level abstractions or higher level patterns or more opinionated abstractions. And it's been really exciting this year to see exactly that happening. We see it happen internally at Amazon as we build construct libraries on top of the AWS Construct Library. We see it happen with other customers internally, and we're seeing it happen in the open source community too. One of the projects that launched this year that I was particularly excited about is the AWS Solutions Constructs Library. So this is still an AWS product. It's not provided directly by the CDK team. It's actually owned by the AWS Solutions Architecture Group. So what I think is so cool about this product is that we have this vast group of solution architects that are working with customers and helping them build their applications successfully, these large systems on AWS. And they're able to take all that expertise and that knowledge that they've gained from working with customers and building these systems, and they encode it in these higher level patterns. So these are typically patterns that are a little bit higher level. They often use multiple services. And it's really, I think, a great example of the power of this reusable components that we talked about. So you can leverage that as a customer by using these constructs. You don't have to work with these SAs and have them come out and custom design your solutions. You can stand on top of the work that they're doing and the constructs they're providing. So I think this is a super interesting area of the CDK. There is another reInvent session called Turbocharge the AWS CDK with AWS Solutions Constructs, where you can go check out for more information. So that was an AWS product. We're seeing the same thing happen with this construct library ecosystem emerging in the open source community as well. So there is a group of individuals in the community that have banded together to form the CDK Patterns website that you can go check out. And this is basically a group of infrastructure as code and AWS experts that have started cataloging and collecting some higher level patterns. And there's also a longer tail of smaller construct libraries that we're seeing come out of the community as well. So one of the great places to find some of those smaller libraries is this awesome CDK list. So these awesome lists on the internet, if you've seen these before, there are these collections of different resources. And the awesome CDK list is a great place to go see open source construct libraries, open source references, blogs, and different tutorials that are available. So I'm really excited that we're starting to see the seeds of this ecosystem of construct libraries grow this year. And I hope that next year we're back here talking about an even bigger ecosystem with even more options for all of our customers to choose from to build on top of. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the programming model for the CDK. So we talk a lot about constructs and how we instantiate these constructs and build this tree of constructs that we then synthesize into some sort of lower level configuration. So for the AWS CDK, we synthesize this into a cloud assembly that has all of our assets packaged up, as well as our CloudFormation templates. So we started to realize that this programming model was really bigger than just the AWS CDK itself. And really you could apply the same programming model to any place where you have lower level or complex configuration formats that often don't have the same amount of rich tooling as programming languages or the same ability to encapsulate and reuse components. So we abstracted out some of these core classes, and I want to talk about a couple of examples of where we are applying this construct programming model to other domains. So the first example I want to talk about is the CDK for Terraform. Terraform is another really popular infrastructure modeling tool provided by HashiCorp, and we're big fans of Terraform here at AWS. It helps a lot of AWS customers provision their infrastructure. So we started to realize that with HashiCorp or with Terraform, customers are typically using HCL, the HashiCorp configuration language, to model their infrastructure. And we started to realize that we could bring the same construct programming model to Terraform customers. And we talked with some of our contacts at Terraform. They were excited about the idea. And we worked together on a very small prototype initially. And then HashiCorp really took it and ran with us. And since then, HashiCorp has launched the CDK for Terraform. Early this year in August, they launched an alpha of CDK for Terraform. And it's the same idea that you can use programming languages, TypeScript, JavaScript, Java, and Python to model your applications with Terraform. So the CDK for Terraform is a project being led by HashiCorp, and it works a little bit differently than the AWS CDK. So with the AWS CDK, we talk a lot about the Construct Library and building on top of that. The analog for CDK for Terraform is the Terraform registry. So one of the things I think is cool about the CDK for Terraform is that you're not limited to AWS. You can use any provider in the Terraform registry and any module for any of those providers. So you essentially import that provider and the modules you need, and then you've got this programming language experience for modeling your Terraform infrastructure too. So if you're a Terraform shop, I would highly encourage you to check out an awesome webinar that HashiCorp put on a couple months ago called Provisioning Infrastructure with the CDK for Terraform in Python and TypeScript. Awesome webinar that goes into a lot more detail about how to use the CDK for Terraform. The next example of where we're applying this construct programming model that I want to talk about is CDKs, or the CDK for Kubernetes. So this is a project that we're driving on the AWS side, and it is really created for anybody using Kubernetes. So we launched a developer preview of CDKs, the CDK for Kubernetes, as well as a library of higher level abstractions called CDKs Plus. And I'm super excited that this project was accepted to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation as a sandbox project. So we're really excited to be working with the community on this one. One of the things that I think is particularly cool about this project is that there's really nothing AWS specific about CDKs. If you are a Kubernetes shop and you're producing Kubernetes configuration, you can use CDKs to produce that configuration. You can take that and you can run it on AWS, you can run it on-prem, or you can run it with any other provider because it's just really Kubernetes configuration. So I think that this is a really exciting project that we're just getting started, and I think this is going to go some really cool places in the future. If you are a Kubernetes shop and you want to learn more about this one, there's a great upcoming reInvent session called Simplifying Kubernetes Application Management with CDKs that you can check out for more details. All right, so we've talked about a lot of new projects and new features and new products that we've launched in the past year. And of course, we're going to be continuing to invest in those projects and keep growing those features and experiences. But I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of the new things that we're just barely getting started on, some of the things that you can look forward to launching in 2021. So before I talk about a couple of those projects, I want to make a quick meta point and talk about the CDK RFC's repo. So earlier we talked about the public roadmap for the CDK that gives you this higher level view of the work that's in progress. And the CDK RFC's repo is kind of the other side of that. So in the CDK RFC's repo, you can go and check out some of the ideas that are a little bit further out, ideas that we're just exploring or we're just starting to consider and we want to kind of flesh out a little bit more. So a lot of these projects or these RFCs, may not turn into real projects that we immediately pick up. They're ideas that we're exploring. But if you do want to get a further out view on where the CDK might go, or if you want to provide feedback and help us influence the direction of the CDK, this is a fantastic place to go and interact with some of the engineers and take a look at some of the designs we're writing up. All right, the first big project I want to talk about is the CDK version 2. So CDK version 2 isn't going to be a huge change in terms of the CDK APIs that you use to build your CDK applications, but it does still have some pretty impactful changes that we think customers are going to be really happy about. So the biggest change in V2 by far is changing how we package the AWS Construct Library modules. Today in V1 of the CDK, each of the AWS service has its own module or its own package. So this is analogous to how we package the AWS SDKs. And that makes a lot of sense for the SDKs, where you need to include this as part of your runtime application closure, and you really need to be able to limit the size of your application bundle. So we started with this very highly modular design for CDK V1. But over the past year, we've been learning from customers and hearing a lot of feedback and seeing how this has actually added some friction into different parts of the development for our customers. One example of that friction is that as you're in your code working with different services and modeling your infrastructure, when you want to use a new service, you have to kind of break your flow and go out and import a new dependency and then get back into your flow with the code. So that's one small example of some of the friction this adds. But I think really the biggest example, and what really kind of made us realize that this was a change we needed to pivot and make, was the friction that it adds for growing this ecosystem. So when you build these construct libraries on top of the AWS Construct Library, you have to deal with this very modular structure, and you have to deal with these version conflicts and keep all of these versions aligned for all of these modules. And that's really what kind of triggered us into seeing that that's just going to put a damper on the ability for this ecosystem to grow. So that was one of the big reasons where we stepped back and decided to pivot and make this change to a much simpler module structure. So I'm pretty excited about this change. I think this is, a small change, but it's going to have a big impact on the overall experience of using the CDK. The next big change I want to talk about is making a cleaner split between the GA APIs that carry a backwards compatibility guarantee and the experimental APIs in the CDK that are subject to change. So today in the V1 code base, we have a lot of experimental APIs that are kind of scattered throughout the code base. And they're all documented as experimental, and we try to draw attention to that. But it's understandably been difficult for customers to constantly reference the documentation and know if APIs are GA or experimental. And unfortunately, that's upset some customers when they've been relying on these experimental APIs, and those APIs have changed in version updates of the CDK. So this is another piece of customer feedback that we've been listening to very closely. And I'm super excited to announce that in V2, that one module that will contain the construct library will all be GA and will all carry back a strong backwards compatibility guarantee. We will still have some areas of experimentation, but those will be outside of that main module. So developers will essentially need to opt into using those experimental features, and it'll be a much clearer split. So I'm very excited about this, also driven by listening to customers, and I think this is going to be another change that makes customers very happy. And then finally, as with any major version of a product, we're going to take this opportunity to do some minor code cleanup, remove deprecated APIs, and just do some tidying up and housekeeping. All right, the next big project I want to talk about is a Golang CDK. This has been the #1 feature request in our repo for a while now. It's got close to 1,000 upvotes, +1s, and comments, and we've been really excited to bring this experience to customers. So it's taken us a little while to get started on this because building out Go CDK support is a pretty big undertaking that involves some really interesting technical problems and also some really interesting design challenges. So when we build out multi-language support for CDK, we do so by building a layer on top of the core TypeScript codebase. So with Go, we have this Go layer built on top of the TypeScript codebase. And these two processes need to communicate with each other. And we architect it this way so that we can provide these experiences in all these different languages, but at the same time, we can also ensure that the features and the behaviors are all in sync and consistent between all those different languages. So the technical challenges around building Go are really around implementing this inter-process communication protocol and managing all the communication back and forth between those two runtimes. So some interesting technical challenges there that we're working on. But I think even more than that, there are some really interesting design challenges as we map this TypeScript CDK codebase into a very idiomatic Go experience. So TypeScript, of course, is a very object-oriented language, and we're using a lot of OO features pretty heavily in the CDK. And things like inheritance and polymorphism, of course, aren't core concepts in Go. So there's, I think, an even more interesting design challenge here with how we map that TypeScript codebase into a really clean, easy to use idiomatic Go experience. So we're really excited to be working on this and making progress in the Go CDK. We're going to have some early alpha builds out hopefully by the end of this year, and we'll need a lot of feedback from all of our Go customers to help us get the APIs correct. All right, let's wrap things up and talk about where to go from here. So we've covered a lot of material in the past 30 minutes. We've talked about a lot of new features and new products. So I want to leave you with a collection of some of the different link callouts that I mentioned throughout this session. So if you are brand new to the CDK, I hope that you will start with the CDK Online Workshop. It's a great place to get your hands on the code and experience the CDK. After that, there's a lot of great samples in the AWS CDK examples repo. I think that's really the best way to learn CDK is getting your hands on the code and experiencing it yourself. And then for everything that we talked about and the different sections of this session, there's webinars and reInvent sessions and other deep dives where you can go to learn more. Well, all right, that wraps up our session for today. I hope that you all saw something interesting and something that inspires you to go out and learn more about that feature, that new product, and try out some of these new CDK features. Thanks for watching. We'll be looking forward to seeing you on GitHub.